The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the CECAN webinar. My name is Martha Bickett. I'm a CECAN researcher at University of Surrey, and I will be chairing today's webinar with Dione Hills and Helen Wilkinson. Dione is a principal researcher at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, and Helen is Director of Risk Solutions, both CECAN partners. Now, for those of you who haven't joined us before, CECAN stands for Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. We're a research centre funded by a group of UK research councils, government departments and agencies. Our aim is to test and promote innovative evaluation methods. That's methods that take into account and are appropriate for the complexity of the world around us. To date, we've been looking in particular at nexus issues. That's the interlinked areas of food, energy, water and environment. If you want to find out more about what we've been up to, read our manifesto, Policy Evaluation for a Complex World, available in the resources section on our website. We are doing today's webinar a bit differently today. I'm broadcasting live from the Tavistock Institute, where I'm joined by Dione and Helen in person. And in addition to those of you joining via the internet, we have an audience in the room with us here too. So welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining, and please bear with me if there are any awkward pauses as I try to hop between my virtual and physical roles. So today's webinar is inspired by and based on some of the work that CECAN's been doing for UK Government's latest edition of the Magenta book. That's the Government Handbook on Evaluation. Before we begin, a quick few words on how this webinar is going to work. Dione and Helen are going to speak to us for the first section, around up to 45 minutes, and then we'll have until 2 p.m. for questions and answers. Please submit your questions via the question box, which you should be able to see on the GoToWebinar control panel, which popped up when you joined the webinar. As chair, I'll then have the pleasure of posing those questions to Dione and Helen in the Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar, all the way up to the very end, and I'll do my best to get through them. The session will be recorded and should be made available on the CECAN website afterwards, as long as all the technology works. So it's my great pleasure to welcome and pass you over now to Dione and Helen. Dione first, so let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Martha. So I've just got to bring up my slide so it's visible. Show my screen, yes. Okay. So nice to see so many people coming today. First of all, I just want to outline what our webinar is going to cover. So first of all, we're just going to talk a little bit about what it means to have the challenge of policy and policy making being messy. And then I'll say a bit more about the CECAN's work in this area. And then looking at that messiness through a complexity lens and talking about some of the features of that messiness in terms of complexity science or complexity thinking. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some strategies in terms of when you're planning an evaluation or managing it. And then I'm going to pass it to Helen, who's going to talk more about methods and design solutions. And then we should have about 15 minutes at the end for questions and discussions. So messy evaluation. So I'm just aware that I need to take down the screen. Okay. So the policy world, as all of us know, is messy. There are many different aspects to it. Things can be emergent and embedded. There's sometimes a struggle to achieve what you intend to achieve. Unexpected changes will happen. And a common problem is that the outcomes of a policy or intervention can sometimes be not specified at the outcome. And evaluators are often asked to ask relatively simple questions like, did it work or did it create value? And this is particularly tricky. Although we've got many tools in our evaluation toolbox to handle evaluation of different types and kinds, a lot of these methods or tools that we have available are actually tend to assume that the intervention, the link between the intervention and the outcome is going to be relatively straightforward. and it doesn't. A lot of them don't really take into account the characteristics of complexity. Just some of the terms that are used in the field. Simple is often used to refer to something that's relatively recipe-based. There's a fairly straightforward recipe or a set of instructions for what happens. Complicated often means something like a machine. There are many moving parts, but they're predictable in their relationship with each other. And complex, as many of you who are parents will know, is like bringing up a child, is unpredictable. There might be all sorts of twists and turns in the developments that you can't predict at the outset. So many policy and programs, probably most of them are complex to a certain extent, but this complexity is going to increase the more innovative the intervention is, the more it's taking place in a new and developing area, which brings in uncertainty. The environment in which it is taking place, if this is rapidly changing as well, this brings a whole other level of complexity. There may be many different organisations and individuals involved in the delivery of the programme or policy, and there might be many actions introduced at different levels, for instance, at a national level or a local level. And I was thinking, one example, we had a programme which was looking at interventions to reduce juvenile offending, and there were interventions that were taking place in the community, in schools, lots of different types of projects and activities. And this brought many different players into the picture. There were schools, there were teachers, there were community organisations, there were the young people themselves who were taking part in the initiatives. There was a local authority, there were organisations at a national level that were supporting it. So there was lots of different activities taking place. And another feature of complex intervention of this kind is you get a lot of diversity of views, of opinions. So for instance, there might be very different views on how to prevent juvenile offending. And different people at different levels in the systems, the young people might have a very different view of the intervention to the teachers or the community groups, for instance. So you might actually have disagreement or a lack of agreement anyway, both on what kind of actions are most effective and what the outcomes might be. So we found it quite helpful to look at the mess of complexity through what's called the Stacey matrix. And Ralph Stacey developed this when he was trying to apply complexity theory to organizations in particular. And he had two dimensions, the horizontal one, which is where there's, this is about certainty, how predictable and certain the activities are. So if something is very predictable and certain, it takes you to the simple end of the matrix. And the more diversity, more uncertainty it is, the more it takes you into the area that's called chaotic. And similarly, there might be a high level agreement between the participants, which leads to a relatively simple intervention. But the more you've got diversity of views, the more it's taking you into the chaotic end. And in between sort of chaos and complicated is this area which is called complex, and it's the area of that is studied, and is the term complex adaptive systems is used. And some of you might have heard the term edge of chaos, which is where life exists actually. It's where things are evolving, things are changing quite rapidly. It's the area of innovation in organizations. It's exciting, it's movable, it's not too stable. When you go to the simple end, things are very stable and static, ultimately totally unmoving. So I've always quite liked this cartoon, which looks at complexity, how evaluators see it. So at the simple end, for instance, it's very clear the relationship between the intervention and its outcome is relatively clear-cut. When things are complicated, the outcome will depend much more on the context in which it's taking place. But when you get into complexity, it appears as if every situation is totally unique. But I think the thing I particularly like about this cartoon is that the idea of being totally lost in the wood, not being able to see the wood for the trees, lost in a bush, is how it feels very often when you're in a complex domain. Things are very unclear cut when you get involved for the stuff at the beginning. So what we wanted to do was just to outline some aspects of complex systems that might be useful for you. And that's one of the things that those of us who are involved in developing an annex that we were asked to produce to complement the new revision of the Magenta book, which is ongoing at the moment. We brought together complexity scientists, systems, people who did systems mapping and evaluators to really identify some core features that presented particular issues for evaluators. And we also got an artist to design some symbols that could help communicate these in a straightforward way. So one of the first aspects of a complex system is that it's an open system. It hasn't got a clear-cut boundary around it. And there's a lot of interchange between what's taking place around the policy, the program, the initiative, and what's going on around it. And if I could just go back to the example of this initiative for young people to prevent offending, they could take place in lots of different situations. It might be a relatively stable environment in which there were lots of job opportunities for the young people, or it might be in an area where there's much more poverty, or there might be a gang culture. And obviously the kind of intervention you put in place is going to be affected by those other things taking place in the wider environment. Frequently the description of a complex system starts with the fact that it's made up of many different components which are all interacting, but the components themselves, as well as having relationships, they are acting independently. But one of the things that is useful to note is that some of those relationships, some of those components will have more influence over the whole system than others. And this might be because they've got more connections with other parts of the system, or it might be because they have more power. So for instance, in putting an intervention in a school, the view of a head teacher will be very important because they have a lot of say over what takes place in the school. On the other hand, there might be other parts of the system that might be quite resistant and slow down. If they're not brought on board, it might cause grit in the machine, as it were, and make it difficult to bring an intervention to a successful delivery. And I think most of us will recognise that when we're putting in place a programme or policy of identifying key organisations that might act as champions or key individuals that we know we have to get on board in order for it to be successful. And in complexity terms, this is described as levers and hubs. When you're system mapping, you'll often mark these out, particularly on the map. The other feature of a complex system is that it's emergent. It's not how it's going to run. It can't be laid down from the top down. It's a function of the behavior, of the relationships, the activities of all the individual components. And new properties emerge as those different agents interact with each other. So for instance, water turns to ice when the different molecules are behaving in a different way to each other than when it's in water. And similarly, a supermarket queue forms because individuals choose to join the queue. It's not something they've been told to do. So it's a function of the behavior of the individuals, and that's referred to as an emergent property. The other thing is that in a social system, where human beings are concerned, the actors or the different components are actually able to learn and evolve, and how they make sense of what's happening will affect their behaviour. So the system behaves in response to the intervention. And then out of that, you can get feedback loops. So something is working really well. So going back to the example of the school intervention that's put into place, if it's seen to be effective by parents and other teachers in the school, then they're more likely to refer children into it. If it's seen as not being effective, then there might be real resistance either to referring people or to supporting it in other ways. So feedback loops can both work to increase or accelerate an intervention, but it can also suppress any change taking place. The fundamental problem for evaluators in complex systems is that they're highly unpredictable. and the relationship between inputs and outputs is not linear. There are many unknowns, particularly when you first get involved in the system. You're not quite sure what kind of feedback loops might be there, what kind of levers or points of intervention are going to react, how they're going to react. And this is the unpredictable can go in many different ways. Something can suddenly accelerate, and change can take place at a fast rate, or it might really slow down, or it might be bumpy. It might suddenly accelerate and then slow down. So these kind of unpredictable changes, you don't know at the outset exactly what's going to happen, and also it's going to be different in different contexts depending on those other factors that are coming in to affect it. Another thing that's really useful for us as evaluators to be aware of is the idea of domains of stability, and also talked about as attractors. And this is the idea that complex emergent systems have settled states that are relatively stable, and that they don't change except when something very strong is coming from the outside. Well, a policy or program is, in a sense, designed to move a system out of that stable state. It's trying to bring about some kind of change. And a tipping point typically refers to the point at which the system has moved from one stable state to another. And this has been recognized, for instance, in neighborhoods which will suddenly change from one set of characteristics to another. And I think, well, there was a book called The Tipping Point, so it's almost come now into general use as a term. But it's useful to know because, in a sense, a policy or program is aimed to bring a system over a tipping point. But in many cases, if it's a short-term intervention or program on short-term funding, sometimes it will be taking it out of a domain of stability, but then the funding might be withdrawn before it's totally moved into a new stable state, and you just see everything going back into their prior state, stable state. So what are the issues for an evaluator that we need to take into account? Now, first of all, because there are multiple interactions and influences going on, you get long indirect causal chains. They're not straightforward, the causal chains linking the inputs to the impacts. And in a sense, a lot of process evaluation is designed to map out exactly what those causal chains are. Complex systems are in a state of constant change. Although there might be stable states, even within that, there might be constant change. And this means that when you're evaluating the intervention, you need to be alongside those changes. And this might mean that your overall design or the kind of data you collect might also need to change to take into account the changes within the program. The other thing is the program might not be in a final state when the evaluation comes to an end. It might, the change might suddenly take off after the evaluation has come to an end, or it might have ground to a halt. You don't know. The other thing about a complex system is it's really hard to standardize the intervention. As I mentioned, it's always going to be responding to what's going on in the context in which it's put in place. And that poses a particular problem for any kind of evaluation approach, which is kind of assuming that the intervention is going to be exactly the same in very different contexts. And this can be a particular problem for some experimental methods. You also, as I mentioned, there are many different stakeholders involved in a complex system, all with their own view of what's going on. So you often get multiple perspectives, which means that you do need to collect information from many different sources in order to collect those different views, particularly when there's quite a marked disagreement about what's taking place. You can't assume that when you just heard from one set of stakeholders, you know the truth of the situation going on there. The other thing is there might be multiple causality, so there might be more than one factor which is bringing about change. And this is where some new methods need to be brought on board, which Helen is going to talk you through shortly. And the other thing about complexity is actually knowledge about complex adaptive systems is relatively new. I mean, it's been studied for the last 20 or 30 years, but in terms of the evaluation field, as far as social science is concerned, as far as social research is concerned, the terminology is still relatively unfamiliar. So actually communicating about complexity can be difficult, and people, particularly at times of stress or rapid change, kind of want things to be relatively simple. So finding the right language to describe complexity can be tricky, which is why we came up with some fairly simple symbols which might help communicate it. Now, the good news is, and this is very much the message in this annex to the Magenta book that we're writing, is that evaluation itself can really help when a program or policy is quite complex, because embedding an evaluation, if it's properly planned and managed within the policy or practice, gives regular feedback on what's happening, which can help the policymakers or the program deliverers to understand what's going on. So if things do get stuck, perhaps in one particular delivery place or in the program or overall, you've got rapid feedback coming in from that. And it means that those involved in managing or delivering the program or policy can respond to those changes that are taking place and manage them. So the whole question of embedded evaluation into a complex intervention is really helpful. So just saying a little bit about planning and managing a complex intervention, and coming back to the Stacey matrix again. On the outside of this, this is about planning. In terms of planning and evaluation, the more stakeholders involved and the more different viewpoints you have, the more important it is to have some kind of co-design or active collaboration of key stakeholders in planning the evaluation. And if you've got involved people who are actually close to the ground, they will know some of the feedback loops, the key champions, some of the factors which you need to anticipate in terms of the complexity. And it's also quite useful at this point to have someone who understands complex systems in the design process, or at least the appropriate methodologies to use in complex systems. The more uncertain the intervention is, looking at the horizontal level, the more it's absolutely crucial to develop some kind of theory of change or logic map. And this is recommended in the Magenta book, but we're also saying that it might be useful to do some kind of systems mapping as well as theory of change mapping. And this really, the other key feature there is that once, even if you do that at the beginning, you have to keep revising those as new information about the system comes on board. In terms of management, we very much recommend that the more complex the situation, the program, the policy, the more some kind of agile or adaptive management approach is adopted. And that means that all plans are regularly reviewed, both within the program and policy itself, but also with the evaluators. And at that point, the evaluators can feed in information into that planning process, into a regular review. But it also involves reviewing the evaluation plans as well, and just making sure they're still fit for purpose if unexpected changes have taken place. It's also going to be really useful to be thinking systems, and that means really thinking about the context and the interactions going on within the system, as well as just thinking about the program or policy that's being put in place. So you need data about that. You need data about the context. You need data about the individual components and how they're interacting. And Helen will be talking shortly that it's really useful to be thinking about hybrid designs, not just one straightforward method or design, but you might be able to incorporate different types of evaluation design in the model that you're using. So I'm now going to pass this over to Helen. This might take just a little while to do that. You can see I'm not very used to this sharing, right? I'm struggling here. Going to sharing, it's not being on there, okay. Okay, over to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Naomi. We've got... as Naomi says, I'm going to introduce you to some of the approaches and methods that can be used for complex evaluation. But I'm not going to try and describe them in detail. For a start, I've already qualified to do that for a lot of them. But we'll try and touch on some of the considerations to think about when selecting a design or designs. And as I said, describe some of the broad families that can help tackle these different aspects of complexity. The first thing to say is there's a wide range of approaches that are available that will do a very good job in helping understand complex environments if you take into account the factors that Naomi mentioned in terms of planning and managing the evaluation. Unfortunately, there's no simple mechanistic way to go around selecting the right ones for your needs. And as Naomi said, mixes of different approach might actually be the best way to move forward. And that mix may change over the course of the evaluation. But we think there's three key interrelated things to take into account when you are designing your evaluation and carrying it out. And these very much build on Elliott Stern's design triangle, which some people may be familiar with. So the three things are evaluation purpose, what you're going to use the information that you are collecting for, your attributes of your system, and that is not just the attributes of the intervention, the policy, but also the environment it's going to be implemented in, it's operating within. And then given that and the factors such as the amount of resource you've got available, time, the expertise, what are the feasible designs? And you bring this together to inform the overall design. So just thinking first about clarifying purpose, in the Magenta book, you'll be familiar with the fact that two purposes are identified, learning and increasing the knowledge base, and accountability. But for complex systems, we would suggest that a third purpose is very important, and that's for listening and building. The first reason for this is to make sure that the diverse voices that Doni spoke about are heard and are brought into the whole evaluation. And in particular, the quieter voices that quite often don't get a say in the design of interventions, the evaluation of interventions. So, for example, the young offenders themselves, perhaps in Doni's example. And emancipatory approaches are particularly designed to help bring those quieter people in. These sorts of evaluations can help build trust in the intervention and the people in putting it into place, and also help generate champions for change. So these levers, these hubs that Diana talked about. For learning, then there's a whole range of theory-based approaches where you're first developing a theory about how the intervention might work and then testing and iterating that through cycles of evaluative activity to start to build a real in-depth understanding of why an intervention is working, for whom and in what circumstances, and to help manage risk and uncertainty, to improve the policy going forward, and to feed into improving similar policies in the future. Accountability purposes include establishing the policy was implemented as intended, so classically the reason for doing process evaluation, whether it's having the impacts anticipated and whether there are any unintended impacts, and whether it's delivering value for money. In these last two cases, often quantitative information is strongly preferred, and that can be a challenge for complex environments because of the fact that it can be very difficult to set up counterfactuals, set up experiments, as Danny explained, and because things keep changing even after the intervention has been implemented. The system might adapt and evolve to respond to the intervention, and the environment might change anyway. And there's a range of processes here based on capturing your theory of change in some sort of model, for example, a computational model that you can then use to predict what might happen if the evaluation wasn't in place, so to build a virtual counterfactual when that's not possible in the real world, or to project forward in time and see how your intervention might carry on delivering outcomes into the future, how sustainable those might be. In terms of system attributes, Dennis showed us a Stacey matrix with a level of agreement on one axis and level of certainty on the other. And she spoke about the importance of seeking those different viewpoints, and in this case, participative approaches, which brings people actively into the design of the evaluation, are really useful to get at these multiple approaches, and can help develop consensus, or simply an agreement on where people disagree, where differences are, and that can be very useful in its own right. Participatory approaches are also useful where there's a lot of uncertainty. For example, what's driving the relationship between intervention and outcomes? Are there a lot of factors that can influence outcomes in a way that are difficult to understand and predict? Have unanticipated outcomes occurred, or do the anticipated impacts just not seem to be occurring? And system mapping can be really helpful here, and doing that with people drawn from all across the system, who stakeholders of the intervention, and work out how we think the intervention is working within the system. And by taking a systems mapping approach to building a theory of change, you can quite often address many of the criticisms at a level that a lot of logic mapping and theory of changes approaches, which they can be quite linear. They don't take into account feedbacks. But by thinking about trying to understand the system and trying to understand the feedbacks, you can get around those sorts of limitation. If outcomes are expected to differ on context, then there's a whole range of theory-based approaches, such as realist approaches, which really look at unpicking how people make decisions in response to an intervention and how their context affects that. And so really builds a depth of understanding. And if the policy and the system in response to this is continuing to evolve, then there's a class of approaches called developmental evaluation, which I'll hand over to Dione now to talk about. And Dione, I can't find my...
Thanks, Helen.
Oh.
Do you want to move on to, you need to move it to the next slide, the developmental slide. There we go. Okay, nice picture of the book there. Michael Quinn Patton a few years ago published this book called Developmental Evaluation, and this is a type of evaluation that is specifically for very innovative situations or programs that are really leading edge. So you don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be, and it's usually taking place when in a very dynamic environment. There's lots of information, and we've got some links at the end for particular places to look, but you know, if you Google developmental evaluation, there's information online, or from Better Evaluation website. But the key principle is essentially developmental in purpose, and it's based on an action research approach where the evaluators are embedded in the program and regularly giving feedback to the people managing or delivering the program, so this can be taken on board and incorporated into the planning process. But it's also introducing a high level of evaluation and rigor into that process. It's also really ensuring that your evaluation is really focused on what the people delivering the program want to know. It specifically uses a complexity perspective, and I really recommend the book and the materials on developmental evaluation for a good explanation of complexity and complex adaptive systems and their meaning for evaluators. Also incorporates systems thinking, and it's profoundly about co-creation of the evaluation, where the evaluators are working closely with the people delivering it, giving timely feedback. So, Helen, over back to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. So moving on to whether a design is feasible or not, one needs to think about the expertise required, and some of these approaches do require specialist expertise, for example, modelling approaches, which may largely at the moment lie outside the evaluation community. You need to think about the data that will be available or obtainable. So, for example, is it possible to set up an experiment where you can control a lot of variables so that you can measure the impact the intervention is having on its own? Where you need a really broad breadth of information, how are you going to collect that? Do you have the resources available to do that? And this should all be based on an understanding of the information you really need to meet the purpose of the evaluation, to make the decisions you've got to make, and what the risks would be of getting the answer wrong. Another dimension we think it's important to think about are whether the key stakeholders, the commissioners and the users of the information, are going to be comfortable with the approach proposed. So in some organisations, there's a great emphasis on quantitative information. Others are more comfortable with qualitative information that looks perhaps in more depth in links between cause and effect. And it's important to think about how acceptable your approach will be. Not to let that drive necessarily design, but to understand that there may be a job of work to do to explain why it is that sometimes it's impossible to achieve a very high level of quantitative rigor, even when you're using very sophisticated evaluation methods, simply because of the level of uncertainty associated with the system and the large number of factors that are influencing and can continue to influence outcomes. So, bringing all that together, coming back to again to the Stacey matrix, and plotting these families of methods on it, looking down at this simple end where we're close to certainty, and where agreement, close to agreement or agreement simply doesn't matter, then these experimental and statistical designs work really well and can let you know in a quantitative way how much policy is making a difference, if at all. But as we move further into these areas of uncertainty where there's more interconnectivity, more factors, more variables driving the outcomes, then it becomes more difficult to apply experimental and statistical methods to the whole of that space. And there's a whole family of theory-based designs that can help address that. So we can use mapping and modelling to build understanding of the system. And identify those parts of the system that perhaps would be amenable to experimental methods. So, for example, testing how messages are being received may be one part of the intervention. We can use predictive modelling approaches to look at how much policy is making a difference. Building our theory of change as a quantitative model, for example, using methods such as agent-based modelling, which allows us to look at how the properties of the system emerge from the interaction of agents, of individuals or groups down at the ground level. So mapping out, modelling these properties of emergence. As I said, though, these types of approach can be used to create a virtual counterfactual when it's not possible to create one in real life and look into the future. We can use configurational methods such as QSA, qualitative comparative analysis, which helps us understand what conditions are needed to make a difference, what's necessary to make a difference, what's sufficient to make a difference. These are very powerful because they treat the variables, the context variables, as part of the problem, part of the factors that influence outcomes. And they can be used where you have only a few cases to compare, whereas experimental and statistical methods often require you to have a lot more cases in the method. There's a group of methods that are very useful for unpicking more about how the policy is making a difference, if at all, called generative causation methods. These look at unpicking the processes or the mechanisms that are causing change, and looking to see both in terms of whether that's program methods and also, or if one's related to our intervention, and also what other things can be causing or contributing to outcomes. So it's a different way of looking at attribution and contribution, but a very powerful way of understanding what can work for who and in what circumstances. I would also like to give another plug for these participatory, these developmental methods, which are involving people actively in the co-design and delivery of evaluations. These can even be used for modelling, predictive modelling approaches, because models like agent-based models, simulation models, can be very difficult in complex environments to validate. But by getting people from across the system involved in building the model, parameterizing it, interpreting the results, you can really build a very high level of understanding of what's going on in the system, how the intervention is working, even if you're not entirely convinced that the numbers it's producing are right. Participatory methods help build consensus and shared understanding, and they support these adaptive management processes, which Dione highlighted as so important for when you're working in complex environments, and empower agents for change. Now, so we haven't described any of these methods in any great detail, but there is lots of information available across the internet and different sources. In particular, I would recommend CECAN's website, where you'll find lots of information. We have evaluation policy and practice notes, which describe a lot of these methods. We have events and training courses, which I would encourage you to look at and sign up for if you're interested. Better Evaluation, is an extremely good website with a whole host of sources of information on methods and evaluation strategies. And for people who are interested in learning more about complexity, we think that Complexity Labs is a similar sort of website, sort of wiki system, which collects lots of information on complexity and complex adaptive systems. So with that, I shall hand back over to Martha.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you to both of you. Hi, everyone. It's Martha again. We now have some time for questions and answers. If you have some questions, please do type them in and send them over to me via the question section in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. I'll start off with a couple that have already come in. The first question is, depending on how you draw the boundary around your system, can't everything be treated as complex? Are there any tools or tips out there to help evaluation commissioners decide when you don't need to treat the system as complex?
Shall I have a go at that? You're absolutely right. Most interventions, because they involve people and organisations, are complex to some degree or another. But at the beginning of my presentation, this is Dione here, I did sort of lay out some conditions which indicate the more levels there are to an intervention, the more different aspects there are, the more complex it's going to be, the more disagreement, as we've said, between different stakeholders, the more complex it is. And yes, in fact, one of the points that I didn't highlight on an earlier screen was that setting a boundary is absolutely crucial and very difficult in a complex system. And if you define the boundary very tightly, so some of the behavioural insights interventions, for instance, they could do a randomized control trial. It's simply, the changing of a word on a letter is a very tight boundary, and you can actually do a randomized control trial if you draw the boundary that tight. But then very often you also need to consider what's going on around that. So in a quite complex intervention, you can do some work to identify what is the core, what is the element that is going to be the same across the whole policy and programme, and what are the features that are around that core that might very justifiably change. So with the core, you need to put some kind of control in place to make sure those features remain the same. So if it's perhaps a walking program for children, you need to lay down the conditions for that and how it's going to be delivered. And that's the only way that you can really put a boundary around that and the difference between where it's taking place.
You just add systems mapping. I think it's a really good tool where you've got a moderate amount of complexity for understanding, or even a large amount of complexity, to understand where to draw the boundary and to keep it, to enable you to interpret the findings of your evaluation, taking into account the things that are outside the boundary of the evaluation, the things that you have not looked at, but you know that they're there and can affect the evaluation. So it helps you interpret and communicate the results.
Thank you very much. Next question was prompted by something in one of your slides, Dione. I believe in your table of challenges, you mentioned the challenge of communicating complexity. Is it better to avoid terms like complexity, emergence, and attractors altogether?
Again, a very interesting question. There are some people at the moment who are saying let's avoid the term complexity and complexity terms altogether. And I do have sympathies with that view. My own experience is that even working with a very mixed audience, and perhaps people who are involved as recipients of a program or not, in a situation where it seems to be confusing and messy, if you introduce a few terms from the world of complexity, it kind of gives a validity to their experience that it isn't just a mess. They're not getting something wrong. You know, you can actually use the terms to validate people's experience and say, it's okay, we understand, you've not got something wrong. It's not just a mess. So personally, my view is that using the terms, particularly now we've got the symbols, which kind of show those terms in quite a simple way, is useful. But Helen, do you have a different view to that?
No, it's exactly the same. I think the complexity terms also give you a language to share what is going on in a systematic and formal way. So you can unpick the different things that are going on and talk about them in a very sensible and structured and systematic way, and I think that's really useful. But don't start with them, I would suggest, and try and pick up if there is language already being used. So many people talk about wicked systems when they're talking about complex systems with aspects of complexity and things like that. So yes, listen and pick up on the language already being used and reflect that back too.
Wicked systems. Helen, do you want to say something else about wicked? What is a wicked system?
A wicked system is one which is difficult to resolve. It's proven in the past that it's problems that are difficult to solve. That things have been tried many times and have not helped, where there are lots of different voices, lots of different perspectives. All the challenges to policy making that complexity presents feed into the definition of a wicked problem or a wicked system. So it's really another word for a complex system which is proving difficult to resolve. And indeed, people say you can't solve wicked problems, you can only manage them, because the system will continue to adapt and evolve to your intervention, so you have to continue to adapt and evolve your intervention. There's a very good report on it from the Australian Civil Service Commission, I think.
And I think some of the examples are obesity, environmental problems. Those are some of the examples of typical wicked, because there's so many different factors interacting to cause the problem in the first place. Yeah.
Wonderful. We've got some really good questions here. I'm struggling which one to choose. This is one that popped up, Helen, while moving a bit more onto methods and approaches now, while you were talking about participatory approaches. When does a listening and building approach cross over from independent evaluation into intervention?
That is a very, very good question, and indeed it's one that exercises evaluators a lot, and I think it depends on the purpose, the reason why you're doing the evaluation. If it is to feed into an objective viewpoint into steering and changing the policy, then it's valid to have that deep immersion in the system. But one of the challenges with complex systems is you can't understand them until you become immersed in them. You can't understand them until you talk and are actively involving people who are living in the system and living with the intervention. And so you're always managing this tension between being an objective arm's length evaluator and actually being able to say something meaningful and sensible and helpful about the intervention system that you're working in. I think I'm going to ask Dione for a viewpoint here, because we struggle with this and we talk a lot in about how to manage that tension.
Well, I think it's quite useful to visualize it in systems thinking terms. The evaluator is always at the boundary between the external world, perhaps the client who wants the answers, or other policymakers who need a decision about the program or the intervention, and the intervention itself. And sometimes you can get drawn inside the boundary, and sometimes you're outside the boundary. If you're too far out, you don't understand what's going on. And if you're too far in, you lose your sense of having any objective view on what's going on. So I think understanding or seeing your role as straddling that boundary and managing the sort of pushes and pulls around it. Of course, it always helps if you've got a team. If they're a team of evaluators, some will be more inside and some will be more outside, so you can be reflecting within the team about that. I mean, I have to say that developmental evaluation, for instance, has been seen more as an organisational intervention or consultancy than evaluation. So if you see evaluation as only being something very objective, then you might be very uncomfortable with more engaged methods. On the other hand, as a good social scientist, one might sort of take the position that there is no true objectivity. We are all part of some kind of social system, and we have the viewpoints that comes with that social system. So the important thing is knowing your objective, knowing your value position, knowing the position you're, and reflecting on that, rather than trying to achieve some kind of unmanageable objectivity.
Very interesting. So this next question, the participant said it was helpful in justifying, for example, the question, why are you proposing realist evaluation? And they noted that they found it interesting to note that experimental studies, note the value of experimental studies for simple interventions in the presentation. So the question is, if a trial shows neutral findings, how would you go about making the case that there is complexity going on, rather than that the intervention was not successful?
I think I would start by designing my trial inside some sort of theory of change framework, so that I understood how much the trial was testing, could test what was going on, because trials usually can only test that, you know, is the intervention making a difference? It's looking at, you know, the intervention and then what outcomes you can measure. You really need to collect other data along the causal chains to understand if something is happening that isn't appearing in the outcomes. So I think my answer would be, I wouldn't start there. I wouldn't start with just a simple trial. I'd put it in a theory of change framework and at least collect some more information in some way that will help me understand the results that I get from the trial.
So in other words, you wouldn't start from here.
Yes.
The Irish saying, I mean, it really is a big plug for ensuring even in the most rigorous RCT trial, you still have to have some kind of process evaluation. You need to at least be segmenting the participants so that you can pick up on whether it's impacting on some groups rather than others. In some contexts, you know, are there contextual factors? But, you know, if you haven't actually built in any measures or assessment of that, it's very difficult to go back up post hoc and make those kind of assessments. I mean, if you're still funded and still have access to the field, then yes, sure, you can go back and ask some more questions. But very often when a trial comes to an end, you've kind of lost the opportunity to do that. So thinking from the start, as Helen said, doing your theory of change and then doing the trial as part of the theory of change would be the thing to do.
So the next question is a little bit around the complexity and evaluation that might arise from managing stakeholders involved and purposes of the evaluation. So the question is, evaluation may, for example, be commissioned to delay proceedings, have a limited focus or legitimize a certain perspective. How do you deal with these kinds of elements from a complexity perspective?
I don't think I'm quite getting the question. How do you deal with
the idea that evaluation might be used to might be commissioned in order to delay something, or in order to legitimize a certain perspective? How do you deal with those elements from a complexity perspective?
Ooh, that's going to take a bit of thinking about.
It's very difficult for the evaluators when you find yourself in that position. And again, this point that Ione says of having a team, of having people that you can go and reflect on the situation and then go back and talk honestly with people commissioning the evaluation about what you think you're observing. But it's really, really hard. situation you find yourself in, not one that one would want to engage with as an evaluator if you know that before you accept the commission, as it were.
Yeah, I think it's just experiencing those kind of pressures and maybe being able to articulate them either to the client. But if the client is the one that is commissioned it in order to prove something works, then obviously, I mean, it's the whole. There's the whole question about how you communicate bad news to clients. You know, you do it appropriately, you do it at the right time. If you've got a good relationship with your clients, you should be able to be beginning to articulate, you know, if they want to prove something is a great success and you can see very clearly it's not, then you need to be collecting good data to justify your view that it's not working so well, but also be beginning to feed that back in an early stage and absolutely do it face to face and not wait for some kind of written report, which means that you can actually begin to have a dialogue about those factors and actually an opportunity for the client to respond to that and perhaps put ameliorating actions in place. But it's if that's the situation that you're in, the person asking the question, you have my full sympathies. But talking with other evaluators really helps. Yeah.
So I guess this question is about the practicalities of applying these methods and maybe around capacity building. Can any one person have the full skill set required to recognize a complex system and design and manage an appropriate evaluation?
That would be a very clever person, I think. Always prefer to do this with a team of people who understand different methods in depth, who understand about complexity, who understand about some of the challenges of evaluation, not just the methodological ones, but the management and the handling the clients, the handling the stakeholders, the things that have just been talked about. It's best to have a team. I don't think one person can design, commission, manage, oversee, have all the knowledge needed to understand all the detail.
I think, particularly in terms of methods, I think any evaluator that's trying to get their head around all the methods, particularly as we move towards some of the quite sophisticated methods that are required to manage complex evaluation, I think it's just, it's too big an ask. I think accepting that there are people with expertise and turning to those expertise as an advisor, having an advisory group to your evaluation, having someone on your advisory group who has expert knowledge in a particular methodology. And even if you've used some of these more sophisticated methods once before, it's still, there are lots of twists and turns to them that it's worth having more than one person's view on.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to start pulling it to a close now. I guess there's just one final question from my side to Dione and Helen. Where can people find out more about this and the methods that we've covered today?
The CECAN website, first and foremost. On the slides, which I think you'll be able to get to through the CECAN website, there's links to the Better Evaluation website, which is very good, and the Complexity Labs website. And of course, you can approach CECAN or CECAN members to talk about any of these methods as well. We're quite happy.
Yes, I think particularly the CECAN Evidence and Policy and Practice, EPP. There are a number of short papers that were actually written in plain language about some of the methods are really useful. And of course, all the a lot of the past workshops and seminars have been recorded, and the recordings are on the website, so you can go to those as well.
Wonderful. So all that remains is for me to say thank you very much to Dione and Helen from me and on behalf of everyone listening today. For everyone, yes, we will have the webinar recording and slides up on our website, cecan.ac.uk, at some point after this. Check the website to get in touch if you have any more questions. That marks the end of our webinar today. Huge thanks again, and thank you very much for listening and our live audience today who joined us to take part. Goodbye.
Thanks, Martha. Thank you.